إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا ومن يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم وبعد. So, my name is Imam Saeed Purcell. I work in the outreach department here at ICI. We have been continuing a discussion on Dawah discussions. And so far we've done a brief introduction and started to talk about the pillars of Dawah, which are three, primarily the call, the caller, and the called. We've spoken about the first two previously. We are up to the point where we're going to be talking about the third and final one of the pillars, which is the called. In other words, the person that is being called to the religion of Islam, the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Inshallah, we will try and keep it to the usual time frame so that we'll finish by about 9:45 at the latest, inshallah, possibly sooner. But we're going to go ahead and go through this, inshallah, and I'll just preface this by saying it's been a long time since I went over this material, and I was amazed to see how many of the concepts that I talk about all the time with my trainees were part of this presentation. So I was actually very pleased to review the information all over again. So we're talking about the characteristics of the call, the person that we are calling to the religion of Allah, the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of the first things, the objectives or the things that we need to investigate or look into first and foremost that Dr. Bilal Phillips Hafidhullah mentions at the very outset, the very first thing, and this is something that from my experience sadly, it shouldn't need to be reminded, but it always needs the reminder, which is what is our objective, conversion or communication? And as much as many people will know how to quote that the objective is to clearly communicate the message, practically speaking, many times, the obsession is with the conversion. When you look at Dawah organizations, many times their metric that they use to judge how well their Dawah is doing is how many shahadas they've had. That is not something that we have control over. Our control is over our actions, our behavior, what we do, which is the delivering of the message. The inevitable outcome of that delivery is not in our hands, and we know this. We've heard it many times before, and he mentions the ayah that is well known where Allah is saying, إِنَّكَ لَا تَهْدِي مَنْ أَحْبَبْتَ, speaking to the Prophet ﷺ, and specifically obviously talking about Abu Talib, his uncle who passed away in a state of disbelief. But saying that indeed you cannot guide whom you love. You do not guide who you love. So just because you have a strong desire to guide someone doesn't mean that you will be successful. Doesn't matter how many methods and approaches and everything else that you employ, the inevitable hidayah is not in your hands. Your job is to do your utmost to deliver the message in as clear and concise a form as possible. So he says, he mentions that, he says that the mission that we've been given is the same one that was given to the prophets, alayhim as-salam, may peace and blessings be upon all of them, which is essentially to deliver the clear message, balaghul mubin, a clear conveyance of the message, of the information, the truth of the message of Allah, the religion of Al-Islam. So we have to constantly remind ourselves, and like I said, I've worked with many different organizations and through many different Dawah departments and committees and things like that, etc. And unfortunately, many times, the metric that they use is the shahada. How many shahadas have you had? They try to brag about how many shahadas that they've had. And one of the things that he made a point in his lecture around this same topic is that rarely is a conversation you have as a da'i with somebody going to be the one and only conversation they have before they make the decision to take their shahada. Extremely rarely are you going to be the one and only person that they talk to. Most of the time, and he used an analogy of like a plant or a farm. He's like, one person plants the seed, another person waters the seed, a third person prunes the plant as it's growing. A final person comes along and as the plant has matured, plucks the fruit at the end. This is the one who takes the shahada. That person who plucked the fruit, who received the shahada on their hand, as people like to say, is not necessarily the one who put in all the work that came before. And in fact, most of the time is not the one that put in all the work that came before. The number of the shahadas that we've had here over the last 6 months or so, which we have had a few, and quite a regular basis, mashallah. But most of the time that had nothing to do with us. That was because of a friend or a coworker that had spoken to them before or had been speaking to them and brought them by the masjid, or just they were investigating on their own. Many different ways. We just happened to be there at the end in order to be there for them when they made the decision to finally take the shahada. That doesn't mean anything about the individual that's giving the shahada. And that's, again, not the objective. Your goal is to clearly convey the message. The one example that he gave when he was giving his lecture, he was talking about a person that came to the Dawah center they had in Qatar, where Sheikh Bilal Hafidhullah was based at the time that he was first presenting this. And he said, he came in, he said, I don't want you to try and convert me. It started right off the bat saying, I don't want you to try and convert me. I just have 2 questions. So he proceeds to ask his questions. Dr. Bilal gives him his responses, and the responses are satisfactory for him, and he gets the information that he needs. And then Dr. Bilal challenges him, says, so what's preventing you from becoming Muslim at this point? And he thought about it. He's like, I don't know. He didn't want to convert. He came in like, don't try and convert me. But he clearly had done research and had talked to other people or had done a lot of reading prior to that. He had gotten all of the basics squared away. He just had 2 specific questions he was struggling with, he was challenged by, that he needed answers for. Once those questions had been answered, there was nothing left in the way. But Dr. Bilal wasn't the one who finished that, who started that process. He just happened to be there at the very end. And that's the same thing that happens with many, many people. And it's important that we bear that in mind, is that we're not necessarily the ones to give the shahada, and that isn't our objective, our goal. Our goal is to make sure that they have the best understanding possible of the religion so that they are able to make the decision for themselves, because they have to decide for themselves. You can't decide for them. This is a personal journey. Every one of us, our journey in our deen is a personal journey. Our fathers, our mothers, our spouses, our children, they can't make that decision for us. They can't be the ones to help us walk along that path. At the end of the day, we have to be the ones to make that decision and to take that journey. And that's no less true than for a convert. Converts need to have been part of the process and the decision to make that jump, to change that identifier for themselves and become Muslim. And they need to be ready for it, because there's a lot of things that come with it. So it's very important that they're being called to Islam and the clear message. And next point, and I was really amazed that this was here, because like I said, I hadn't looked at this material probably in 10 years. Another thing that I've mentioned to people all the time, and he very second point that he comes up, he said, listen before you speak. This is a huge thing, because and he goes into detail in his lectures, and I have a story that I'll share from one of the Dawah booths I'd been part of here in the DFW area. The idea being is that you can't assume about the people that come to you what it is that they need, or what it is that they even believe necessarily. Just because they say they're Christian, not every Christian is the same. I can tell you from personal experience, my mother, who worked for the church for most of her life, decades of her life, she herself will tell you she's a bad Methodist. She worked for the Methodist Church for 30 years, till this day is still volunteering for the church very actively in her 80s, but she will tell you flat out she is a bad Methodist, because she has a very individual theology. Very unique concepts that don't fit with Methodist doctrine. Any more than many of us, if we were to put a book of Aqidah and start opening up and going through the book and go, is that really what I believe? And we're being honest with ourselves. Many of us, if we're being honest with ourselves, we go, I'm not so sure about that one. There'll be things where we aren't necessarily in 100% alignment with doctrine necessarily. It's just the nature of things. It's just the nature of things. And so in order to be able to engage with people where they're at, you have to talk to them. And talking to them requires then that you listen to them in order so you hear the answers. What do they actually believe? Or when they come to you, what is it that they're actually struggling with at that moment? Do they have a particular question? Are they generally interested? Whatever. In terms of listen before you speak, the importance of this and the danger of assumptions. And I probably have told this story before. There was a Dawah booth we did at UTD about 2-3 years ago. And I was there mostly in an advisory capacity. I tend to try and let especially when I'm at the universities, to let the MSA students do most of the talking and engage with the people passing by, because they're going to be students like themselves, etc. And it's for their benefit that we're doing this. It's not so that I can be there and show off my muscles, my Dawah muscles and everything else. That's not the purpose. And so young man was talking to somebody that had come by the booth, and he was going into his usual canned speech about whether it's Tawheed or Islam, the 5 pillars, the 6 pillars, these things and that things. And he's going on and on for 5-10 minutes with this young man that had stopped by the booth. Eventually, when the young man got a chance to have a comment of his own, he explained to him, I believe in the Greek gods. His theology was Zeus, Apollo, Minerva, these sorts of gods and goddesses that you see in Greco-Roman architecture and things like that. That was his theology. His theology was that sort of ancient paganism. And it's not as strange as you might think. One of the most amazing things that I ran into in the early days when I was working in the prisons was in sitting in the chaplain's office, they have books of resources for all the different faith groups. On the shelf, there was a book for Odinists. What are Odinists? Odinists are people that believe in Thor and Odin and Frigga and all of these Norse mythology gods. It is a vibrant community of believers in Odinism within the prison systems. If you had told me that before, I would have thought you were crazy. But I've seen it firsthand. It exists. And there's all sorts of other things that that people come up with all sorts of beliefs. So you have to talk to people. You can't assume just because in that instance, a young white male comes up to you that this guy must be Christian. Or here we're in Texas, so this guy must be Baptist. You can't make that assumption. Now, statistically, sure, you have a basis to make that assumption, but you don't want to do that. You want to talk to people. And as you talk to people, you're able to come to a better understanding of where they're at and what they need, what they may be struggling with, and it allows you to be much more specific and direct with the conversation that you have with them and what you present to them. So the idea that you have to listen first is so important. He gives different examples of how people did not have a need to understand certain concepts, similar to the young man at UTD that I was just describing. Another thing he says here is that you should put yourself in the other person's shoes. So he mentions here that, and this is a really interesting point, and it gets to another thing that I've talked about before. He said many times when people walk away from a Dawah booth or from an event even, they don't necessarily remember the words that were spoken. That PowerPoint that you established, those words you strung together so deliberately and eloquently, or at least you think. A lot of times, that isn't what they remember. What they remember is the interactions that they had, the way things were communicated. I think we may have touched on this briefly in another context once, but nonverbal communication is huge. The actual words we speak, the content of our message, according to some, I don't want to say statistics, but some breakdowns of the content of communication, the different components that go into a successful communication event, by some accounts, make up 7% of effective communication, the words we speak. The other 93% are tone of voice, body language, all these different factors that are completely nonverbal. Our character, our demeanor, and how we're interacting with people, even, things that we might not even think very closely about, but those things matter much more. And the graciousness that we show and things like that, those things are the things that affect the communication process so much more and convey so much more meaning. So one of the examples he had given, Dr. Bilal Hafidhullah had given in previous lectures, was talking about somebody who has an attitude of contempt or dislike for the people they're calling. And so they understand academically that you should smile when you're standing at the Dawah booth, so they're smiling, but their smile is the one of somebody who really dislikes you, and so it doesn't look convincing. And we pick up on those things. People don't think we pick up on those subtleties sometimes, but we really do many times. We have a sense of it when we're interacting with somebody, if they like us or respect us or things like that, even without them saying a single unkind thing. Many of us have probably had this experience with people, whether it's in grocery stores or in office spaces or things like that, people that just the way we interact with them feels wrong. And the same thing happens at a Dawah situation, that you have to be in their circumstance and understand how things might be received. So, and they don't remember, so all of this stuff and he says, he made an interesting point here, is that we're typically in a mindset of we want to quote a verse of Quran or a statement of the Prophet or even statements of scholars or things like that, etc., to prove our points, because this is how we learned. But if you think about who we're talking to, 9 times out of 10, this is not how they learned. This isn't even how they engage with their religion. So to use that style is already going to lose them, because it's almost as if you're speaking a foreign language, because this isn't how they process things. You have to find, he gave an example of, instead of quoting the verses, you share the message of the verse without necessarily quoting it verbatim. You're still calling to Allah based on, the words of the Quran and the Sunnah, but you're doing it in a way that exhibits a little bit of wisdom to understand that you have to filter for people so that they can hear the message without being put off. That's like I can tell you that in Christianity you'll find people that they throw Bible quotes at people all the time when they meet them. I guarantee you, most people, they don't want to speak to these people or see them on a Sunday or any other day during the week, because they're burdensome for people. And that's even something they believe in together. So, this idea that we have to be mindful of even these subtleties that we take for granted, that we're used to this and we think this makes perfect sense because it makes perfect sense to us, but we're not the ones that need to understand. We need to try and convey that understanding to them. And that means that we have to approach them in a way that makes sense to them. And so this is where knowing the people that you're talking to, which is why this is one of the pillars, is so important. Next larger category it talks about is reading the situation that you're in. When you're giving dawah to somebody, the situations aren't always going to be the same. And it gives a number of different examples. You have to read the situation. So timing is one of the things that you do. You have to remember is the timing, finding the appropriate time. So is it the right time to talk about this subject or this thing or that thing, etc. So and he gives an example from the Sunnah here, and actually from the stories of the companions, radiallahu anhum ajma'in, where Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, radiallahu an, may Allah be pleased with him, his students came to him at one time and they said to him how much they loved his lectures and sermons and they wanted more. And he said to them at that point, he said that I wish that I could give more. The only thing that prevents me is the sunnah of Prophet Muhammad. He used to take care of us in giving sermons by selecting a suitable time so that we would not become bored. People don't like to think of the idea that people would become bored, but here even the companions, the Prophet was caring enough about them and understood their situation that overburdening them with too much would be burdensome. And this is the companions. So this is again, a lesson to ourselves, is that how honest are we with ourselves? Because it's what's expected sometimes, we say like, yes, of course, we'd love to have another darts, another halakha or something like that, etc. But the reality is, many of us were not paying attention when we're sitting there for it, etc. Or people are looking at their watch, waiting for the sheikh to finish so they can finally get up and leave because it looks bad. That's the only reason they stayed. It wasn't because they're listening or they're interested. They stayed because it looked bad if they got up and left. So understanding this and choosing suitable time. So like he gave an example, like if you're at, it's actually ironic because there was an event recently that one of the international Dawah organizations did. And it actually reminds me of this scenario. So he gave an example of somebody that's busy with something of worldly nature, and you try to talk to them about the reality of life and death. They're out shopping or somewhere like that. And so he's like, this is not likely to be a good situation to try and have that conversation because they're caught up in the middle of dunya, basically. They're neck deep in worldly concerns right now, and you're trying to talk to them about life and death. And the incident I'm referring to in terms of the International Dawah Organization, they sent a team to the World Cup finals in Brazil. And the team was out there, and their shirts and everything was, is life just a game? You're at the biggest match of, the years, and you're trying to talk to people about is life a game or not. Their minds are somewhere else entirely. Even the people that did stop and listen, the likelihood that they took much away from that, aside from just an interruption in their revelries, is likely minimal. So it's this idea of picking and choosing our moments so that we can have the most effective outcomes. So if you give too much or you speak too long, so again, also being brief sometimes is not being too long-winded or something like that, etc. People talk famously about the people's attention spans, and you hear different quotes. Some people will talk about 45 minutes. Some people I've seen, on the verge of just a few minutes, in single-digit quantities of like 7 minutes or something like that. But people, they don't have a lot of energy, a lot of time. And so it's like you have to be able to be, concise. And he talks about how the Prophet, of course, he was blessed with the ability to have al-jawami al-kalim, this comprehensive, concise speech. So he could use very, very small words and short sentences and phrases and communicate vast quantities of knowledge and wisdom in those simple phrases. I mean, so much so that we're still studying, of course, his statements till today and finding new wisdoms and reigniting things for us when we're looking at them, mashallah. And that we need to be equally frugal with our words when we're speaking and not become too long-winded and everything else. Generally speaking, if your conversation has gone more than about 10 minutes, you probably should, and I've seen this in other settings, you say if your conversation is going a little longer than about 10 minutes, you probably want to arrange to meet somewhere else at another time to continue that conversation in detail or in a great, in a more comfortable setting, etc. Because most dawah booth settings or things like that is, it's not something that's planned, it's not comfortable. You don't have the ability, and I remember in a dawah training I did years ago, I talked about, because this was for a fairground. We were training for a fairground. And it's, for most fairs are in the summer, of course, right? So I want you to picture this. Picture trying to talk to somebody at the state fairgrounds in the middle of a Texas summer for more than 5 minutes about anything they aren't desperately interested in. Is their attention really going to be on you? Or are they going to be thinking to myself, dang, it's hot? They're going to be wondering where the nearest cold drink is or something like that. They're not going to be focused. And even subtle things like this, we need to be mindful of. As I'm saying this, I'm reminded of what I've been dealing with at the state prisons recently as I visit. When we go for Jummah, except for this last facility I was at, the spaces we're in are not well cooled. They don't have air conditioning. So they have massive industrial fans blowing continuously in the room. So trying to give a khutbah, lead a salah, and talk to people in that setting, it becomes much more difficult because you have competition going on. And you have all these different sorts of companies. You have to be mindful of all of these kind of things and realize, how much time and energy are you going to put into that, and how really attentive are they going to be able to be in any given setting. So it's very important. And then it talks about, of course, the audience itself. And this is an interesting point that he made, and I agree 100% with this, is that you need to be mindful of the audience. You read the audience, the circumstance. Are we talking to a group or an individual? And here he made a very interesting point. Again, I haven't looked at this in probably 10 years, and so when I read this, I was very, very reassured, because this is something I believe wholeheartedly. He made a comment about, if you ever have the choice, you don't always have the choice, but if you ever have a choice, one-on-one versus group is always preferable. Group settings are not ideal for a host of reasons. Among the ones that he mentioned was the group dynamic. In other words, if you're in a group, you're less likely to be agreeable to things that people are saying that go contrary to the group think of the room you're in. Like, say you're in a room full of Christians and somebody in there is really leaning into Islam, but because of the setting they're in, they can't let that show. They can't give positive responses to things you may be saying because of the perceived social consequences it may have for them. I know even my mother, in conversations I've had with my mother, she talks about how, she would have such a difficulty because all of her friends and all of her co-workers and all of these people that she knows, her whole world is built around her church relationships. So for her to give positive response to the religion and to even consider the idea of converting, she's giving up a lot more than some other people might, because that's her whole world. And so we have to be mindful of people's circumstances and those sorts of situations, and where if we ever have the chance, we do things one-on-one or in some very small groups as much as possible. And this is one of the reasons why in our facility here, instead of doing classes for converts, what I've started to do is a direct one-on-one mentoring, because I find it much more effective and much more easy to tailor to the specific needs of each individual. And we're able to deal with what's important to that individual at that time, versus being trapped into a curriculum that nobody is necessarily at that point. They're all in different stages and phases when they're at that. So it's a lot easier to go one-on-one. And he gives examples of this. He gives an interesting example here from Surah Yasin, where he quotes the story where different messengers were sent to the people and they weren't being responded to. And finally, a man came running from the farthest corner of the village. He says, "Follow the messengers. They don't ask any reward for you. And what is wrong with me that I do not worship the one who created me, and to him I return?" So even them, they wouldn't respond to them because it was a group think dynamic. It was the community as a whole was being addressed, and they were rejecting messenger after messenger after messenger. And according to the tafsirs, he was saying they even were killing them, etc., because where the one-on-one communication was much more effective in those scenarios. And so this idea that that's a crucial element to not lose sight of. So if you really want to convince someone about something, you need to talk to them one-on-one, maybe too. And he gives some examples of sorts. And he talks about location here. Look at the location, Mount Safa. He gives the example of the Prophet using Mount Safa as a place to call the Quraysh in the early days, because that was well known. It's sort of like, I don't know in the US if there's anything similar to this, but like in England, they have Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, which is famously known for debates and loud public addresses and things like that of just random people. And that used to be a big thing for the Muslim community in England. They would send their da'is to Speaker's Corner to go toe to toe with the crowd and the people that would gather there trying to sway opinion and things like that, etc. So there was a very specific style of address that you had to use there because of the culture of Speaker's Corner. It was more adversarial to a certain degree. But so each location has its unique qualities. It says, different times you can choose, you may be at a mosque, you may be an Islamic center, restaurant, coffee shop, bar, university, auditoriums, many different places here versus being, somewhere neutral, etc. And sometimes if you can't bring people here, because sometimes people have a reluctance to come to the mosque because, again, there's that social pressure, or there's that feeling like they're going too far. Sometimes you have to be willing to go to them to find opportunities to put it in a context or in a place that's convenient to them, so that they can be receptive to the message that you have to provide for them, etc. And then now he starts to get into specifics about the individuals themselves and talking about the demographics and the nature of the group that you're calling, etc. And so this is where, of course, you have where Allah mentions about not sending any messenger except that he spoke the language of his people, as a means of saying that you want people as much as possible. It's not always possible, but you want people that are from the culture, from the language, that can speak to people. So when you're, like if we're going to talk to the average Texan, or at least especially outside of the immediate metro area, you're probably sending me, because I'm going to be much easier for them to adjust to. Actually, and I would push back on this in a certain context. So yes, they won't have initial reactions to me because I look like them, I sound like them a little bit. But here's something that I think people don't understand sometimes. They sometimes react more negatively to me than they would you, as people coming from Muslim societies or something like that, because they see me as a traitor. When they look at me, sometimes what they see is a traitor. So there's the absolute truth to this, but there's aspects of it that you sometimes need to understand as well, that especially in an area like we are here, where you get outside of the metro area, you're dealing with, shall we say, more conservative-minded individuals. I will be perceived as a traitor sometimes, because it's like you left your religion, you left your people, that there are aspects of that people sometimes react to. And of course, all of the usual things, etc. But so, having that ability to speak, and so it varies. I mean, in certain settings, and I've seen this firsthand, and people sometimes don't believe me when I tell them. I said, sometimes, believe it or not, they would rather hear from you than from me. They're able to hear you better than they are me, in spite of the linguistic, accessibility that I might have over somebody else, because it's seen, and sometimes you could argue that it's a way of otherizing the religion and making it something that's distant and is not as scary as somebody that looks like them, sounds like them, grew up like them, going, no, this is really good. Then it's like, oh, now I don't have the excuse of this is those people. It's like, this is my people too. It's like, now what do I do? I don't have that excuse anymore. But sometimes they would rather hear from you. They feel it more authoritative when they hear it from you, when they hear it with an accent, when they hear it with broken English. They sometimes actually feel like it's almost more authoritative or more authentic, because in many people's minds, they make this assumption that it's a brown religion. Whether shades of brown, obviously we know, but a brown religion. And so it's like when they see me, it's like, how can you be white and be Muslim? I can't tell you how many times I get that. How many times and it's like, how can you be Muslim? You're white. That actually, people, honest to goodness, still have issues with that concept, that white people could be Muslim. It is actually quite hilarious sometimes. So you want to be able to, but you need to be mindful of the individuals and their backgrounds and things like that, so that you are eliminating in general as many of the barriers, the dissimilarities between the caller and the called as you possibly can. And another one he brings up here, and this is related to a statement from one of the companions where he talks about you should talk to the people at their levels. Intellectual levels is what is referring to, uqulihim, their aql, their level, their intellectual levels. So you don't talk to, say, graduate students or people that are highly educated and successful the same way you would to somebody who's a blue-collar worker working at like Walmart or someone like that, and that is their life, that is their career. Their reference points and their ways of processing things in the world is different. Certain arguments you can use with that person who has a high amount of education or maybe is very, very specialized in their, in their role and things like that. You can talk to them in certain ways and with certain topics and subjects that are going to be effective with them, that if you tried it with the blue-collar worker, they're going to be, lost. There's actually a couple that I'm dealing with right now who's recently converted, but both the husband and the wife have some mental health issues. They have limited capacity, and things like that, etc. So when I explain the religion to them, I have to consciously, be mindful of, I can't talk the way I normally talk, which tends to be a little too high. I always get complaints that I talk above people's heads. That I need to really be conscious of the fact that I need to be more basic and more simple in the way I explain and present things for somebody like that, because getting into all of these higher concepts is going to be something that's going to be difficult for them, if not impossible for them to really grasp. And so we need to be mindful of our settings and our surroundings. Granted, these sorts of things we can't perfectly control or know, so there's a limit to how much we can adjust to these things, etc. But being aware of them and adjusting to them to the best of our abilities is always preferable. Yeah, and then misconceptions, dealing with the misconceptions that people have. And he makes an interesting point here, is that you don't want to ignore the misconceptions necessarily always, but sometimes you have to pick and choose. And he gives an interesting example here about the interaction between Abraham and Firaoun, when he's talking to Firaoun and he says that, my Lord is the one who gives life and death, and Firaoun is like, I give life and death. And so he could have gone straight to that misconception that you don't understand what I'm saying, you're this, but he doesn't do that. He just switches tactics. And he then says, my Lord is the one who brings the sun from the east, you bring it from the west. And then that completely defeated him and left him, perplexed. And so sometimes it's not every single thing that's thrown at you that you need to respond to. And he made an interesting point in his lecture about, and I've seen this firsthand many times, is that you'll get people, you're talking to somebody, and someone else is starting to try and throw like misconceptions and doubts and things at you to try and muddle up the conversation you're having with this individual. And it can throw you off, or you can get too tied up in responding to them and you lose the opportunity of talking to the person who's actually interested versus somebody whose only goal is to stop you from sharing the message. And so it's important to understand that that's dangerous. And he made, and I don't remember if it was at this point or not that he made this point, but he made another interesting point that I've seen firsthand about when you're at a booth, sometimes you'll have somebody who starts talking to an individual. The minute somebody sees, say you're talking to somebody who comes up to a Dawah booth, now he comes over and he wants to join the conversation. He comes over, he wants to join the conversation. Suddenly you've got a whole little party of people standing there and everybody's taking turns just throwing stuff in, etc. This one person now is surrounded by a team of people, and that can be very, very unnerving for people. It's like, if you see someone engaging with somebody, it's like, let them do their thing. And this is hard for people at Dawah booths many times. They feel like they have to get in and they have to be part of every conversation that's going on, and you don't want to get caught up in that. You have to be mindful of the fact that for some people, this is just the idea of approaching a booth and having a conversation is already a daunting thing. And so if you start to throw a whole bevy of people around them, you start to create even more and more anxiety and more uneasiness around it, etc. And it can become very, I mean, you think about if you're in a strange place, in a strange setting, and you suddenly are getting surrounded by total strangers who are all bombarding you with information or questions or things like that, etc., sometimes being quite forceful in the process. How unnerving would that be? You know, it's extremely unnerving, and it takes a little bit of practice to know that. It's like, just sit back, and like he had said in his lecture, and this is exactly what I've done, like the UTD example I was giving. I was letting them do their thing. I stepped in, and they would call me in if they got stuck on a question or if they felt like this person needed to talk to me or something. But you lay back, you only come in when you need to. You don't keep interfering and interjecting necessarily. And then he talks about choosing your approach, the choice of your subjects, etc. Is that, you know, that you want to be mindful of how you're choosing your subjects and talking to people, etc. Obviously, our goal is to, and we mentioned this when we were talking about the call, eventually bring it back around to Tawheed and to Allah and to the proper understanding of Him, and then the finality of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But you have to be mindful of, and he gives an example of something that happened some years ago. Muslims got really obsessed with the Gospel of Barnabas. And many people, I actually know a guy in Minnesota that's like this. Every chance he gets, he talks to people about the Gospel of Barnabas. And he said, this was, because people felt like, here's this Christian book, and it's, saying many things similar to the Muslims about the beliefs in, Jesus not being God himself, or, et cetera, crucified, et cetera, that, and then mentioning Ahmed by name in the book and stuff like that. He's like, that's true. It says, but there's other stuff that's very un-Islamic in terms of the creeds and the things that it teaches in that book. So you have to be careful about what you're making your priority. You want to keep it to the basics and to the core. And so being mindful of those things so that you don't get lost into them. And then method of delivery. Do you want to use an emotional approach? Do you want to be, he says here, emotional arguments are to be avoided in general. Because they tend to cloud the issues. Sometimes they are the best method. And he gives an example here about how there's narrations where the prophet was giving a speech, and his eyes became red, his voice became raised, his face became flushed. So he was filled with emotion. He was very passionate about it. And so sometimes emotional appeals are valuable and are important. But he's like, that isn't always necessarily the case. It may be appropriate for a Friday sermon, but said not necessarily for giving the dawah itself. And so other times logic could be appropriate, and so you have to pick and choose how he did. And he gives an example here. the methods of correcting. And the example he gives is interesting, but the one that always stands out to me when you talk about the wisdom and how you address people is a story from Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein. And they witnessed an old man who basically had no clue what he was doing when he was trying to make wudu. And so they were still relatively young at the time, but they saw the situation and they could have approached him directly and said something. But in the society and in general, that would have been seen as disrespectful, and it might have hurt his feelings, things like that, because they're young boys, and then they're here correcting this elder man, and et cetera. So there's the age difference and everything else. And so what did they do? They approached the man and he said, "My brother and I are having a disagreement about who makes the best wudu. Watch each of us and tell us which one did it better." And they proceeded both to make wudu, and then asked the man to judge. And he got the message without them having to say anything, that embarrassed him or made him feel small. But he got the message, and he praised them for how excellent their wudu was in comparison to himself. And so he got the lesson he needed without having to be shamed or humiliated in the process. And so this sort of wisdom and this sort of ability to try and find ways to make these things happen, and that takes a little bit of work. And he talks about the importance of using multimedia and things like that, et cetera. This is just, it becomes more and more true every year that we need multimedia and things like that to be effective in the message reaching people. And so you see a lot of that. And he talks about a number of different things here. True historical, and he talks about the importance of stories, using accounts, but true stories, ways to help deliver the message or convey the lessons. They have something called the moral of a story. And so finding stories where you can draw out a moral lesson. There's some stories that are popular in the Arab world about Juha. They're actually very comedic many times. And sometimes they have some very interesting lessons, but they get about it in a very unique and sometimes quite humorous way. And I'm going to assume there's probably something similar in other cultures and things like that, but these sorts of stories and these sorts of even plays, et cetera, they can be very effective when used in the right way to help convey certain messages that would be otherwise difficult for people to hear. Because, again, not everybody is going to be able to sit and listen to a lecture and just drone on and on and on, like I'm doing right now. But so it's the idea of these stories and finding all these different methods that people can use to reach. As long as you're not perverting the message and the truth in the process, there's many methods that Allah has shown us in the Quran and through the Prophet's life and his steps. And he talks about gradual progression, is that you have to realize that not everybody's at the same level, and not everybody's going to move at the same speed necessarily. And so it's important to see where people are going and not try and move on to another thing if they're still struggling or still stuck at something else. You have to be mindful. And again, like he talked about, sometimes this whole journey that people have, you're not going to be the only person they talk to. And the process of the conversations they have and the reading they're going to do and everything else, days, weeks, months, years. I remember one story I read recently, and I'll close on this, inshallah. Man who had just saw someone carrying a Quran and asked him, "What is that in your hand?" Because he saw the Musaf with the writing and everything else. Very beautiful, right? So he asked him, and he told him, this is the Quran. And he didn't tell him much more about it than that. And that was it. That was the only thing, the interchange that they had. 10 years later, this man remembers this thing still and sets about looking for that book. Proceeds to eventually find it, a translation obviously, and start to read it, and eventually he became Muslim. But it was 10 years between just seeing somebody carrying a mushaf and asking about it, and then 10 years later, still thinking about it, and getting that book, reading it, and then eventually becoming Muslim because of it all. This is the thing, we never know the smallest thing we might say or do. And this is really, in a way, it's actually kind of scary when you think about it, because the subtlest, simplest, most out-of-mind interaction we could have with someone could be that incident that they remember years later. The question we need to ask ourselves is that going to be a positive memory for them and draw them closer? Or is it going to be a negative memory and push them further away? This man, all he had to do was see a mushaf and ask somebody, and they at least were willing enough to respond to him and tell him a little bit about it. Even though he didn't, he'd never touched it or really looked at it or anything at that time. But that somehow, Allah left that seed in his mind for 10 years before it started to sprout, and he started to search that book out, and eventually he became Muslim. The smallest things we do can be impactful. So it's really a warning to us to say that we really need to be mindful of how we're interacting with the people around us, and realize that every single individual we interact with could be another called. What are we presenting to them in the end, though? What is the call that we're presenting to them? Are we being good examples and good communicators of that message, or are we part of the problem? The reason why it's so easy for somewhere like Fox News to spread these sorts of vicious lies about our community and have so many people believe it. That doesn't happen in a vacuum. That happens because we are not good enough examples to counteract that narrative. We need to do better. And we need to be mindful of the fact that everyone we're interacting with is a potential called. Inshallah, Allah will guide us all to an understanding of His deen and a sincerity in sharing it to the best of our abilities with people, in every instance, in every situation that we interact with people, so that we become a source of benefit to people at every moment, and not a source of detriment for them. Inshallah. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Yeah. Right.
What is significant for them? Like we can, how this, it's very complicated. I've never worked on it.
Yeah.
Advice on that, like how it would be like talking to someone from those backgrounds.
I'll be honest, I've not had to deal with them. And it's somebody that has dealt with Hindus in the past, or even the Greeks. Like, I mean, with Greek and Roman gods and even the Norse gods, they were notoriously, for lack of a better word, flawed. They were, even though they were gods, quote unquote, they were very human. They had jealousies. They were infighting amongst them. They were, fraternizing with the creation. I mean, there was very little distinction between them. If you know some of the stories, I grew up with a lot of the mythology. They would fraternize with the creation. So I mean, like with Allah, we have a very clear distinction. You have al-Khaliq wal-Makhluq. There's creator and creation. Finish. There is no, there's a strict hard barrier between the two. They do not intermingle. There is no, there's not the fraternizing the way that you see with their. When I say fraternizing, I mean in the purest sense of the word. We're talking about fathering children with their creations and stuff like this. So very just very base, mundane sorts of interactions. So I mean, they're very, and this is even with the Odinists. They don't see the gods as gods the way we think of gods. They see them as like examples or like, larger like archetypes to pattern themselves after and things like that, etc. That they don't necessarily take everything from their life. So it's a very bizarre sort of relationship, and how we, and again, even when you talk about that, Greco-Roman religion in its heyday in the ancient world, and what people practice of it now, like even the Odinists, likely has nothing to do with one another. So it would really, again, you get back to a question of talking to the people and trying to understand, because their understanding might be very unique, from what the doctrine would be for that group. And that's true of many people, is that their personal beliefs about something rarely matches doctrine perfectly. And so that's where that conversation with people. And in the conversation, you might find an avenue where you can start to talk to them and move the conversation towards oneness of God and things like that, etc. But again, like in that situation, you would need some familiarity with the theology that you're dealing with. If you can find somebody who believes like that and became Muslim, great. And we do have, mashallah, we do have converts from Hinduism in the community that would probably be well suited to that. But like the Greco-Roman, the fact that the Odinists and those people even exist was a surprise to me when I first found out about it. So, Allahu A'lam. Jazakallah khair.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله